All right, hey guys. Today we are covering the very first section of Chapter 1. Chapter 1, Section 1. And today we're talking about converting fractions into decimals or vice versa, decimals into fractions. So the learning target actually says I can convert a fraction. A fraction might be like 1/3 or a mixed number such as 2 and 1/5 into a terminating or repeating decimal, or a terminating or repeating decimal into a fraction. Hopefully by the end of these two sections you'll have no problem with this. We are going to use our calculators for this, so it really should not be very difficult. It's really just a matter of learning how to use a few buttons on your calculator that maybe you have not used before. To start this, we're going to look at different types of decimals. Not everybody knows that there are 3 different types of decimals. They are terminating decimals, repeating decimals, and the ever popular non-terminating, non-repeating decimal. Those are the 3 types of decimals, and we're going to look at each one and how they convert or don't convert into a fraction or back and forth. First, let's look at what each of these decimals look like. What is a terminating decimal? Basically, a terminating decimal is a decimal that stops. Technically, it's a decimal with a decimal expansion that ends in all zeros. But I like to think of it more as it's a decimal that stops. That's what the word terminate means. It means it stops. An example of this might be like 2.3. 2.3 is a terminating decimal. It stops after the 3. Now technically they say it ends in all zeros because you could write 2.300 and you could tack on as many zeros as you want, and that does not change the decimal. It's still 2.3. But I kind of prefer to think of it as a decimal that stops or terminates. All terminating decimals I said that wrong. All whole numbers can be written with a 0 following the decimal point. Like you can take the whole number 7 and you can write it as 7.0. That makes a whole number, even though it doesn't kind of look like it has a decimal in it, a whole number like 7 is a terminating decimal. In fact, all whole numbers are terminating decimals. But so are lots of fractions. And let me just give you a couple examples. The fraction 3/10, that would be a terminating decimal. That is equivalent to 0.3, and then it stops, right? Or a mixed number like 7 and 1/5. That is a terminating decimal. That would be 7.2. Notice that the whole number part, the 7, comes on the left of the decimal, and the 1/5 comes on the right of the decimal. The fraction comes after the decimal. The whole number comes before the decimal. All right, so those are terminating decimals. Let's move on. What are repeating decimals? Repeating decimals are a decimal that has an expansion that repeats the same digit or block of digits without end. I'll get to what that looks like in just a second. A bar indicates the repeating digit or block of digits. So an example of that might be like the very common fraction 1/3. 1/3 is equal to 0.3333. If you type it into your calculator, you'd see it's 0.3333 repeating. And that, of course, can be written with a bar over the 3. Since the 3 repeats, you can place a bar over it, and that the bar tells you, hey, this digit repeats over and over and over again. A slightly more difficult example might be like 7/15. 7/15 would look like this. Now the 4 does not repeat, but the 6 does. So when you write it with a bar, the bar goes over the 6, but not the 4. And one more. (49 over 33) looks like 1.4848484848. Now you've got 2 digits repeating, so your bar goes over both digits. All right? One thing I'd like you to be able to do is convert back and forth from using bar notation to writing out the decimal without the bar. All right, last up we have the third type of decimal, the non-terminating, non-repeating decimal. What does that look like? You know, there are about 3 types that we'll talk about in this class. There are those that have a pattern, but not a repeating pattern. It might look like this. So this decimal has a pattern. It's 2.010010001. We can predict what the rest of it will be. We will predict how it keeps going, but the problem is it does not have a repeating pattern that you could put a bar over and say, hey, this chunk repeats over and over again. Also, it might have no recognizable pattern. You know a number like this. Numbers such as pi has no recognizable pattern, yet it keeps going on and on. It does not terminate, and it does not repeat. There's another number like this as well, some square roots. Like the square root of 5 would be a number that's just like pi. It would be a decimal that just continues on. It's non-terminating, and it's non-repeating. So those are kind of your 3 types of non-terminating, non-repeating. Those that have a pattern, but not a repeating pattern, pi, and some square roots. All right, all fractions can be converted into decimals. Did you know that? Every fraction can be converted into a decimal. When they are converted into a decimal, they will be one of 2 types of decimals. They will either become a terminating decimal or a repeating decimal. Every fraction either becomes a terminating decimal or a repeating decimal. And every terminating or repeating decimal could be changed back into a fraction. To convert a fraction into a decimal, this is real easy. We're just going to do it on our calculator. You want to divide the top number, the numerator, by the bottom number, the denominator. You want to pay attention on your calculator. Does it look like it terminates, or does it look like there's a repeating pattern? Most of the time, fairly obvious. And if it repeats, I'd like you to use a bar to show it. You know, an example might be the fraction 1/2. On your calculator, if you did 1 divided by 2, you'd find out that equals 0.5. It terminates, so that's your final answer. Whereas if you took 1/3, and on your calculator you did 1 divided by 3, you'd get something that looks like this. Well, this now is a repeating decimal, so you would want to change it and use bar notation and have it look like that. That's really your two options. Let's do a few examples. 5/8 is our first example. So the first thing I should recognize is that fraction bar means divide. That is 5 divided by 8. So I will type into my calculator 5 divided by 8. I get 0.625, and then the calculator stops. This is a terminating decimal, and 0.625 is the decimal for 5/8. 13/6. That's going to be 13 divided by 6. If I type that into my calculator, I'm going to get 2.1666. And the 6 seems to repeat. So I'm going to rewrite that with a bar, 2.16, with only the 6 having a bar over it. All right? One thing I'd like to point out here, 13/6 is the same as the mixed number 2 1/6. If you encounter a mixed number, notice the whole number part of the mixed number comes to the left of the decimal, and the fraction, the 1/6, comes to the right of the decimal. All right, last up I have a really tricky one, 2/7. If you type 2/7 into your calculator, 2 divided by 7, you would end up with this. Now it goes all the way across your calculator, and what I would tell you is there's a good bet that if it goes all the way across your calculator, it's a repeating decimal, not terminating. It'd be pretty coincidental if it was a terminating decimal and it just happened to end at exactly the same number of digits that your calculator is able to display. So I claim this is a repeating decimal. Let's look. I think that the first 6 digits repeat, 2, 8, 5, 7, 1, 4. And then it starts over again, 2, 8, 6. Now I think this should have been a 5, like it was in the first set. The 6 at the end, I think, should be the same as the third number after the decimal of 5. Why do you think it's a 6? Well, I think it's a 6 because the number after the 5, right here, the 7, made the 5 round up when it's the last digit in the number. I think the calculator rounded it up. I think it really would be a 5. This is a repeating decimal, and so it could be written as 0.2857114 with a bar over the whole thing. That's really tricky. All right, that's the end of part 1. I'll start part 2 on the next video. All right, I think we're ready to start part 2 of section 1.1. We've just got a little bit left to go. We are ready to learn how to write a terminating decimal as a fraction. I think the key to this, and it's a good thing to know anyway, is to know your place values. I think you should read the number correctly by knowing the place values. And if you can do that, the fraction pretty much writes itself. Let me give you an example. So you've got 0 point, and I have here is 4 decimal places. Do we know the place value of those 4 decimal places? The first decimal place, the first spot after the decimal, that is called the tenths, all right? The second spot is called the hundredths. The third spot is called the thousandths. The fourth spot is called the 10,000ths, and it really goes exactly the same as when you go to the left of the decimal. 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, million. It follows the same order, except it's got the little THS on the end. Tenths, hundredths, thousandths. So I claim if you can simply take the decimal and put it into words, you can write the fraction. One more thing, you might need to simplify the fraction. Let me do 3 examples. We start with 0.6, and I want to write that in words. In words, that would be, let's see, it goes 1 decimal place, so that's the tenths spot. It would be 6/10. And 6/10 as a fraction would look like that, 6 over 10, 6/10. Now that fraction can be reduced, and when you reduce it, you actually get 3/5. The second one. The second problem is going to be a mixed number because it's got a number to the left of the decimal and to the right of the decimal. To write it in words, it would be 2. Now, do you know how to read a decimal point? Do you know what word stands for the decimal point? It's the word and. This is 2 and, let's see, it goes 2 decimal spots. 2 decimal spot ends in the hundredth spot. So this would be some number of hundredths. In this case, it would be 95 hundredths. And 95 hundredths. As a fraction, that would look like 2, right? The part to the left of the decimal is the whole number, and the part to the right of the decimal is the fraction, 95 hundredths. So it might look like that, except 95 hundredths can be reduced because 5 goes into both 95 and 100. And so really it reduces to 2 and 19/20ths. Your calculator actually, if you typed in 95 hundredths on your calculator and hit enter, it would probably reduce it for you, depending on what type of calculator you have. Last up, we have 7.003. This one goes 3 decimal places, so that means it ends in the thousandths spot. So this is going to be 7 and some number of thousandths. Seven and 3 thousandths, right? The 0.003 would be the number 3. That would give you 3 thousandths. And how would you write this? Again, this is going to be a mixed number because the number to the left of the decimal would be the whole number part. And is the decimal. And 3 thousandths would be 3 over 1,000. Now I wrote a decimal in there. I don't think we need the decimal when we write a fraction, do we? It'd be 7 3/1000. All right. Let's look at, instead of terminating decimals, what happens when we have a repeating decimal. Well, again, we're going to use our calculators for this. There is a cool process to do this by hand, but I'm going to let you use your calculators, so you might just need to learn how to use a key on your calculator. To convert a repeating decimal, type the repeating decimal into your calculator. And make sure that when you type it in, you type in the part that repeats several times, 3, 4, 5 times. Maybe go all the way across your screen when you type it in. And then you're going to use the button on your calculator that converts decimals to fractions. On most calculators, it would be a button that looks like that. And often, this is the second function of a button. So first you have to hit the second key, then that button, and then enter to get the answer. All right, let's look at a few examples. 2.4 repeating. Now in this case, I want you to write out the decimal as a repeating decimal before you actually go ahead and convert it into a fraction. I want to make sure you can go back and forth between decimals that have a bar and what that looks like as a repeating decimal. So this would be 2.4444 and ... right? And when I type that into my calculator, 2.444444, and then I use the fraction to decimal button, I end up with 2 4/9. So there's your fraction. Maybe some calculators, I'm not sure. Maybe some would not give you a mixed number. Maybe some would turn it into 22/9. We'll talk about that if we need to. The next one is 0.416. So here, notice that the bar is only over the 6. So only the 6 repeats. It might look like that. And when you type that into your calculator and then use the fraction to decimal button, you would end up with 5/12. Hopefully you're getting that as well. And the last one actually has 3 numbers that repeat. And in this case, it's got a 0 at the end, and that 0 is under the bar, so it needs to repeat as well. It would look like this. All right, 0.740740. You type that into your calculator, you'd find out that happens to be 20/27 as a fraction. All right, so the big thing here again is, can you convert back and forth between decimals and fractions? We have one more type of decimal we did not look at, the ever popular non-terminating, non-repeating decimal, like pi. Now, how do you convert that into a fraction? Well, as maybe you've guessed, it is not possible to convert a non-terminating, non-repeating decimal into a fraction. There is no fraction equivalent for pi or any non-terminating, non-repeating decimal. They just can't be written as fractions. All fractions either terminate or repeat, all of them. All right, good luck on the homework. Hope that helps.